Of the graduating high school class of 2025, about 94% took the SAT or the ACT, despite most universities being test optional. The first standardized college entry test, the SAT, was administered to high school students in 1926. The ACT followed a few decades later in 1959. Opposition to standardized tests has existed almost as long as the tests themselves, with Bowdoin College becoming the first test-optional university in 1969. In the 1990s, new studies suggested that the SAT favored white wealthy students and predicted only first-year GPA rather than overall academic success, resulting in increased traction for the test-optional movement. However, many institutions continued requiring standardized test scores up until recent years.
Over COVID-19, colleges stopped requiring standardized testing scores, and many schools remain test optional up through 2025. However, many colleges are now returning to requiring standardized test scores. This brings the world and college students into controversy, asking if the test is necessary and if it demonstrates their intelligence. The guiding questions are: can standardized testing account for psychological variations such as test anxiety? How do financial resources affect standardized test performance? How do test-optional college students compare to test-mandatory college students? And what are the possible alternatives to standardized testing?
SAT and ACTs are a sore subject to many people. Either people can never get past a certain threshold, the test is too difficult, or even certain communities feel excluded or in an unfair playing field. The disabled community has been one of these groups for years, with some of their test-taking abilities being the cause for their poor, unrepresentative performance. With the SATs starting in the 1920s, it wasn't until the 70s that disability awareness and aid was put into effect. Prior to that, disabilities were unrecognized, and students that had difficulties had no extra aid, causing lower performance in classes and testing. In 1975, the United States put the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act into effect, finally giving students the aid they need. Although only established more recently, the U.S. Department of Justice has made provisions to improve disabled students' needs with an IEP. An IEP is an individualized educational program that is designed for one person and is individualized by parents, teachers, and other staff members. This solution is used by many to curb disabilities that impact performance. However, test anxiety is not aided by an IEP or other educational plans because it is varied in too many ways. Due to this, test scores have historically been varied and impacted by psychological variations. Many studies have agreed with this sentiment, with one showing that in the U.S., in state testing for students in middle and elementary school, students who indicated having test anxiety accounted for scores of a difference of about 2 to 15% lower than students who didn't have test anxiety. Issues of performance are usually aided with accommodations like an IEP, but lately people have started abusing the system in putting disabled students at a disadvantage again. In the 2010s, College Board approved about 85% of requests for a change of environment and extra time, abusing the already difficult system for people with mental disabilities, making the SAT and ACT even harder, as the comparative results when submitting college applications will be more selective and inflated. The question of standardized testing affecting psychological needs is clear. Psychological variations affect test scores by hurting their performance and demonstration of intelligence. Now, the next question goes to whether this is the only factor in performance and if this is the sole solution to assessing students' future.
Initially, the SAT was accepted as a measure of student aptitude, and the ACT as a summary of students' grasp of high school concepts. However, studies published later in the 20th century began to suggest that standardized tests did not measure students' abilities as accurately as originally believed. In 1985, College Board, the SAT's sponsor, found that the SAT indicated success fairly well in the first year, but not by the end of all 4 years. Studies published in the 1990s found further evidence against the SAT. A student's high school record provided better predictors of success, and students who focused on rote memorization or earning the highest score tended to score better than students who focused on deep learning. The first widely read comparison of test submitters and non-submitters was released in 2004, when Bates College presented 20 years of data on the performance of its submitters versus non-submitters at the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. Between the submitters and non-submitters, average GPA varied by only 0.05% and graduation rates by only 0.1%. More interestingly, non-submitters had a slightly higher graduation rate. Notably, the average SAT among non-submitters was 160 points lower than that of submitters, strongly suggesting the inaccuracy of the SAT in predicting student success. Following the Bates study, a set of studies conducted by the University of California between 2001 and 2005 again found that high school grades indicated student success much more accurately than standardized test scores. In response, College Board revised the SAT in 2005, removing the word analogy section, which tested knowledge of relationships between words, and adding a writing portion. However, many saw these revisions as insufficient. The most recent comparison, released by College Board in June of 2025, paints a more favorable picture. According to College Board's analysis, SAT scores tend to predict first-year GPA, credit accumulation, and retention fairly accurately. Students who disclosed their scores tended to do better in all of these areas, and SAT scores were an especially strong predictor of performance in STEM courses. However, the College Board study, unlike the Bates study, assessed only first-year performance, offering no conclusive information on four-year success.
If standardized testing has become more outdated and not as reliable when measuring students' intelligence and education, what can? Possible alternatives have already been around for years, such as performance-based assessments, or PBAs. They gained more popularity in the late 80s and early 90s, taking a different approach from standardized testing. PBAs focused more on students applying their knowledge and skills in a more practical, real-world context. Some examples would be instructor observations, exhibitions, projects, experiments, on-demand tasks, and portfolios. Each of these allows students to show more individuality, as it can often be personalized with the amount of design choice and freedom offered. PBAs also allow room for questions, hopefully taking away the anxiety that would come along with standardized testing. When it comes to grading these assessments, teachers and professors have some leeway.
When we talk about standardized testing, we often treat it as an equal playing field, a place where everyone has the same opportunity to show what they know. But in reality, financial resources play a major role in shaping performance long before students ever sit down to take the test. Research shows that students from higher income families tend to achieve higher standardized test scores than those from lower income families, and this gap begins well before test taking itself. Reardon. Students from higher income families generally have access to advantages that directly improve their scores. First, they can afford high-quality test preparation, including private tutors, paid courses, prep books, and repeated test attempts. These resources teach not only content, but also test-taking strategies, such as time management and answer elimination, which can significantly boost performance. Financial resources also influence the classroom environment. Wealthier school districts tend to have smaller class sizes, more experienced teachers, up-to-date technology, and stable learning environments. Large-scale educational research has shown that well-funded schools with experienced educators contribute to higher education and widen socioeconomic performance gaps, OECD. At home, economic insecurity also plays a critical role in academic performance. Students with reliable internet access, quiet study spaces, and parental support experience lower stress levels and greater academic confidence. In contrast, students from lower-income households often face additional responsibilities such as working for jobs, caring for siblings, which limits time and energy available for studying.
Standardized testing has shaped college admissions for nearly a century, originally designed to create a uniform way to measure academic readiness. But as we have seen, these tests do not exist in a vacuum. Performance is deeply influenced by factors beyond intelligence, including psychological stress, access to accommodations, family income, school funding, and exposure to test preparation resources. While standardized tests can predict first-year college GPA to some extent, they fail to capture long-term academic success, creativity, resilience, and depth of learning. The test-optional movement, especially during and after COVID, revealed that students can succeed in college without submitting scores, and that removing test requirements does not significantly lower academic outcomes.
At the same time, growing reliance on standardized testing risks enforcing existing inequalities rather than promoting fairness. As students who have recently gone through the admissions process ourselves, we have seen firsthand how a single score can overshadow years of hard work. Moving forward, the question is not whether the assessment should exist, but how it should evolve. More holistic admissions process, one that includes portfolios, performance-based assessments, grades, and personal context, offers a fuller picture of student potential. Ultimately, measuring readiness for college should reflect not just how well students test, but how well they learn, grow, and contribute.